Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, and we're happy to have you with us for this Crisis Coach webinar. This is the 9th in the 2016 series of the Crisis Coach webinars. Today we're discussing natural disasters and business continuity. This includes wind, water, earth, and fire. And we have an extraordinarily good presenter for us, someone who knows this backwards and forward, Jeff Hamilton, who's on the West Coast. And he woke up especially early for us today. We'd like to have our friend on Facebook, Firestorm Solutions. You can follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. And yes, there is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Our attorneys like us to remind you the presentation today is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion. And this work product should be read in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. Do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. The webinar series today is underwritten by the Greater Rochester Chamber of Commerce and the Eastern Great Lakes Association chapter of the Association of Contingency Planners. As I mentioned, this is the 9th in this Crisis Coach webinar series. You can go to firestorm.com and you can watch past webinars and you can register for future webinars. We actually have webinars that go back in this series about 3 years, so there's lots of them there that you can cover. The Association of Contingency Planners chapter, the Eastern Great Lakes chapter, is our host. We normally have Dr. Redmond with us, but she is out on a different assignment today, and we're pleased to have her continuing support. And those of you who've joined us through her instigation, we invite you to join us for future webinars, and we're pleased that you're able to join us today. Our presenter today is our very good friend and our co-worker, Jeff Hamilton. Jeff Hamilton is the Chief Operating Officer of Nexis Preparedness Systems. That's located in California. And Jeff, I'm sure, will tell you what Nexis Preparedness Systems do. So, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you, please.
Thanks, Bill. Yes, I'm with Nexis Preparedness Systems, and our focus is on effective emergency response. And certainly out here in California, where we're in earthquake country, that is a big focus. But as other areas of the country have their own challenges in terms of major events that involve wind, water, earth, and fire, they often result in a regional issue that can get into extended time frames and will cause you to rely on your emergency response supply resources. And these potential situations are where local authorities may be overwhelmed, and it'll be up to your site and your team to protect and sustain employees. And so what I want to cover today is a look at your supply resources and in a more holistic and analytical approach, making sure that your resources are integrated and aligned to your plans and threats. And knowing how to utilize your resources and understanding what you have at your disposal will also be key. Now let's take a look at the math of resources. Typically, when you look at emergency response supplies, they're often done in a vacuum. It's kind of like, well, I've got a plan, I've got an emergency response team, well, I better get some supplies. And you usually sit down, you try to list out what you think you need. And of course, you probably need some food and some water, better get some flashlights, maybe a generator. Might need to get stuff for search and rescue, or if anyone's hurt, need to make sure you have plenty of first aid items. And in situations where an event can be extended over multiple days, like we are out here in California earthquake country, some of the infrastructure may be compromised. You may need to consider things like sanitation, and additional food and water for extended periods of time. But it really boils down to, so how much do I need to get, and what am I forgetting? And there are various lists that you can find on the web, and they're pretty much all the same, and there's not a lot of detail, so you're kind of left up to your own devices to kind of figure out what you need and try to figure out what you might be forgetting. So hopefully today what we cover will give you a little more insight into developing your supply resources. The things you need to think about, and of course, I mentioned we're here in earthquake country, but even in that situation, you have to look at what's around you. What's are your particular threats? Are you susceptible to flooding? Are there wildfires that can be in your area? Are there chemical spills? What about severe weather? We're relatively mild weather-wise around here, although it's been a little hot lately. But there are other areas of the country that have these types of issues, but also have to deal with severe weather. If you're looking at your response plans, and you really need to align your threats and your objectives to your emergency response plans, and this is getting it out of being done in a vacuum. Do you have the right supplies to perform the tasks? For example, if your team objective is to do full-blown search and rescue, do you have the right types of equipment and equipment they were trained to use? If you're simply doing floor wardens and evacuations, then you really don't need to get into that. And as your team matures and you decide to take on that task, that is something you can get in the future. And then you often see on lists, well, you need food and water for 3 days. Well, what does that mean? It's a rather vague term out there on getting ready for 3 days, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is an example I like to use, and you think, well, yeah, I need a generator, and probably need some gas to go with it, but is it really meeting your objective? You need to peel the onion back a little more, and your objective is powering an area for 3 8-hour periods, powering some lights, powering some computers. You really have to look at the metrics here. And again, this is a good example. So a 6,000 watt generator uses about 1.8 gallons per hour. So if you've got that 5-gallon gas can, you're not going to meet your objective of the multiple 8-hour periods. And oftentimes we look at supply caches and people forget to fill up their gas can. You're powering lights. Well, if they're 8 500 watt area lights, you're probably okay with a 6,000 watt generator. But if they're the dual head with a combined total of 1,000 watts, well, you're going to be undersupplied with a 6,000 watt generator. Things like laptop computers, those need good power quality, the same quality you get when plugging your laptop in. So the generator that's pictured here is really just meant for raw workhorse power, and it doesn't give a clean power signal. And so you have to look at a different type of generator, and those are called inverter generators. What's the layout of your facility going to look like when you're getting set up to support an emergency response effort? You're going to set up a sanitation area. You're going to set up first aid and triage, your incident command area, those types of things. You need to get power to them. So do you have the right kind of extension cords to be able to power those things? You have to start looking at length of power cords, the gauge of the power cords, and all those little nuances. So what I've done is really get you to think a little more detail. You have to go through each item and think how it's going to be used and literally do the math. Know the metrics and usage rates. How many people are you trying to cover for how long? Are there any specialized groups that need to be supported? Talked about search and rescue. First aid and triage, to what degree are you going to do that? Do you have a need to put a sanitation area for extended periods of time? Business recovery teams. Are you going to have a team that's going to stick around a bit longer to do site security or help get the business back up and running, they may need some different types of items. Talk about the food and water for 3 days and what that means. There's really only one metric out there that even gets mentioned by FEMA or the Red Cross, and that's a ½ gallon of water per person per day. And people often undersupply that particular metric. And there's nothing about how much food you really need. Well, we use a metric called basal metabolic rate. You can look that up on the web, and it's real easy to put that information in there to find out the caloric needs on a daily basis. And by and large, it works out to about 2,400 calories a day. So that gives you some metrics to use to try to figure out what that food and water for 2 or 3 days really needs. Is there anything about your site and who you're covering that are unique? We have a number of clients that have daycare centers, and what we've found is that infants and to a certain degree toddlers, they have very specific needs. Infants need to get all their hydration through formula. You can't give an infant water and then follow it up with food bars. Water is actually dangerous to an infant. It can cause an imbalance in electrolytes. So you need to plan for those types of things. If you have a senior daycare center, are there any special needs from that standpoint? If you're a healthcare facility, are there things specific to your patients and your needs? So really think about who you're trying to cover. Then you really get to the point of how much room does all this stuff take up, because you have to have a place to store it. And you'd be surprised, it's actually not too bad, even for a period of 2 or 3 days, the amount of room that you need. But you really need to plan that from the standpoint. And so what you consider is really spreadsheeting all this information out, going through, looking at your plans and your objectives and making sure they align, and do the math around it. It'll allow you to do some what-if analysis. We have a tool that we use that takes a lot of the guesswork out, where we've gone and gathered a lot of those best practices and metrics to try to make it easier. But it's certainly something you can spreadsheet out depending on the nature and the scope of what you're trying to accomplish from your supply resource needs. Now let's talk about usability. And what do I mean by usability? This is an actual picture of a supply cache that we've seen, and not very usable. Somebody made a list and got some stuff and threw it in a shed and kind of forgot about it. So not only is this poorly organized and you can't really tell what's there, there's a lot of things that could be expired. Food and water and eye washes and medical components do have a shelf life. And we've seen all kinds of different storage situations. If you look at, here's a little better attempt at of organizing, but still, even though it's on shelves, it's very nondescript. It's original packaging. It's visually very confusing. Where are things? Some things are difficult to access. And what you really need to do is start thinking about your supplies as one giant emergency kit, if you will. It needs to be very well organized, to the point that things are mapped out and visually you know where things are. So there's some interesting tips here, and again, thinking about it like a giant kit. Something as simple as color coding becomes very valuable, because one of the things that you see during an event is that you need a lot of untrained volunteers, if you will. And so if you have somebody that's coming to you willing to help, and you tell them to, for example, get all the first aid and triage supplies and set it over there in that area, you may get kind of a deer in the headlights look, and they say, what is triage? So instead of taking the time to explain what those types of items are, and you use color coding, you can simply say, get everything with a red tag on it and take it over to that area. Boom. You you've employed a resource, they know what they do, it's very simple. Things like functional groupings are very important. As you start to set up your area, being able to roll things out to certain areas, taking things over to a sanitation area, and all those supplies that you need are very important. Setting up a triage area, again, definitely those things you want to have separated, so they need to be a distance from each other, and being able to take those supplies and literally roll them over, and having everything you need set up becomes very important. And then that way you can also start supplying your employees during an event. Okay, make sure my advance is working here. Seem to be frozen up a little bit here. 1 second. There we go. There we go. I'm back. So let's talk about allocations. There are some items that you may have in your supply cache that are common for your emergency teams. Things like vests, hard hats, gloves, flashlights. And it's important to understand who gets what. And as an example, let's say you had a very enthusiastic search and rescue team, and they went in there and they got to the supply cache and they grabbed all the flashlights. Very well intentioned, they're grabbing what they think they need, but if they aren't aware of the original assumptions about who gets what. And so now you've impacted the first aid area, you've impacted the incident command, you may even impact the sanitation area because they're unable to function because all the flashlights are gone, or certain key components that they need that were meant to be allocated out. And so it's important to know what the original assumptions were when you developed your plan, and make everyone aware of those assumptions, and so situations can be like the one I just described can be avoided. And there may be situations where you need to adjust. Maybe there is a more intense search and rescue situation, but at least going into it, everybody is aware of what they were allocated originally, and you as incident commander can make appropriate adjustments as necessary, minimizing the impact on the other areas and still trying to meet the changing needs of the particular situation. So again, that's just something that's it's a very subtle hint, but in the heat of everything going on, it's something that people need to be aware of going forward. So things need to be assigned based on needs. Everyone needs to understand those assumptions and what the original plan was. And before you get into a situation where you have to call back the very enthusiastic search and rescue team and kind of reallocate based on the need, those assumptions are known going forward. So hopefully you don't get into that situation where you're adversely impacting a particular operation. Now let's talk about this distribution and deployment of those resources. And this is can be a very confusing time in the heat of the battle because you have a lot going on. And I'm going to talk about a particular situation. So let's say you're very good and took my advice about looking at the metrics of the situation. You got your half-gallon of water per person per day. You've got your 2,400 calorie food bars at the ready. You've got ponchos and dust masks and emergency blankets that you need to hand out because that aligns the particular threats you may be faced with. And what happens is it becomes quite an operation going forward. When you're dealing with bulk supplies, as an example, each item you need to distribute, you probably need about 3 people. You're really kind of turning this into kind of a cafeteria situation. So let's say you're handing out the water. Well, you need somebody at the distribution table. You need somebody to get the water from the main pallet to that distribution table, and you need somebody kind of climbing around and breaking down that pallet and getting things ready to get to that table. So for each item you're handing out, you're probably going to need 3 people. So if you're looking at distributing food, water, emergency blankets, ponchos, and the like, it gets very labor intensive very quickly. And it also becomes very difficult to control. People can get in kind of a hoarder mentality and think, well, I'm going to get back in line and get a little extra food and a little extra water. And it kind of becomes very chaotic. And again, very high labor requirement, because you have only so many people on your emergency response team, and you may have to bring in that untrained labor from your employee population to help out. And depending what you're handing out, the types of things you're handing out, and how much you're handing out at each time, you may need to do this several times a day. And you also have to remember, you've got folks on that you need to cover in terms of these resources as well, that may be an emergency response team. So that as they come in from doing their particular duties, it may not be at the time you're handing everything out. So you really have to keep that operation going all day. And again, it becomes kind of a labor nightmare, if you will. So what if you can put everything into a single box that you need for that day? And here's an example. This is the half a gallon of water you need per person per day. You've got a 2,400-calorie food bar. You've got the poncho. Well, that's everything somebody needs for a day. And what it does is it makes it very easy to distribute. 2 or 3 people, that one little team of 2 or 3 people can now distribute an awful lot of things to a lot of employees very quickly. And so your labor usage goes way down. It's a controlled distribution. People are getting what they need. They can write their name on it. They can go off and use it as they need it. And from that standpoint, what you're really doing is you're giving the ownership of those resources to the employee. Because during an event, and again, if it's an event where people are literally stuck at work, again, in our case, could be a major earthquake. In other areas of the country, maybe it's flooding in the area or severe weather. People will try to go home to their families, and they can at least take that resource and go from a place where they have resources to an unknown place and have coverage along the way. So they're going from a known situation to an unknown situation. But if they're making that trek of a mile, 2 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles, whatever it is, they have resources that will help protect them along the way. And you're not going to get into the situation where, in case of bulk supplies, somebody comes back and says, well, look, I'm leaving the site. I need some stuff. And then you kind of get into this, well, you're not taking the stuff from the main source. You need to, you're on your own. So it avoids those type of situations by giving the ownership of that resource to the employee. There's another aspect we talk about, efficient deployment of supplies. And I've seen quite a few situations where the supply cache is all very well intentioned. It's beautiful shelves. It's labeled very nicely, and there's bulk supplies. See a shelf of hard hats and a shelf of tools, lanterns. But you can imagine a search and rescue team all converging on the supply cache and literally shopping for what they think they need. And the focus is not the task at hand, which is rescuing somebody, but really trying to decide what they need or what they think they will need, and worrying about what they're forgetting, instead of concentrating on the fact that they need to go out and rescue somebody. And if you look at this picture, that person's about to drop that axe on their toe, so it's very cumbersome. So again, consider putting as many things that you can think of functionally in a kit form, and having, in this case, a robust set of search and rescue supplies where that team can go in, grab what they need, and go take care of business. Their focus is now on rescuing that person and not wandering around in the supply cache trying to figure out what they need. And better yet, if you do something like this, you can actually disperse those supplies widely throughout the campus, and again, make your response a lot more efficient and effective. So it's easy to transport, it's rapidly deployable, and it's ready for a wide variety of situations. Let's talk about coverage. That is one question that comes up quite a bit, and trying to think, well, how many people am I going to cover? If I've got 1,000 employees, am I going to cover 1,000 people? What kind of criteria do I use? Is there an historical reference point? Are you going to guess? Is it driven by budget? It may be driven by a lot of those things. And so this is an example, and this is, we see this actually quite a bit. And many times coverage is based on a guess or a previous reference point. And in 1989, we had an earthquake out here, the Loma Prieta earthquake. And there was some level of road closures, and of course, those of you that saw it on the news, we had the bridges had an issue and people couldn't get home that way. And there was the Marina District in San Francisco that had a lot of liquefaction going on and buildings were collapsed. But by and large, the road systems weren't affected, and people tried to get home. And a lot of them, and most of them could. It took a long time because everybody was leaving at once. And there was a lot of confusion. There's stoplights out. I know it took me about 3 hours for what was normally about a half-hour commute. And so when people use that as a reference point, think, well, there was 10% of the people that stuck around. And so that's what they use for planning. Or maybe they feel a little better that they can fudge that number up and say, well, I'm going to cover 30%, a third of my employees. And if you're looking at doing it for multiple times, or multiple days, excuse me, you're going to cover a third of your employees for 3 days. Well, even if this particular situation, if you did have 2/3 of the people leave, you've got 2/3 of your employees that are at risk because they have nothing to take with them for the journey home. And what if it was a situation where it was late in the day, maybe the weather was bad, it's getting dark, and most everybody decided to stay and venture out the next day. Well, now you have 100% of your employees sticking around, consuming all the supplies in the first 24 hours. And so the people that truly are stuck there for an extended period of time now have nothing for day 2 and day 3. So it's a little bit more of a difficult situation in terms of coverage, and it's based largely on a guess or largely on a reference point that may not be applicable. Again, in our case, Loma Prieta was actually not centered in the Bay Area proper. It was actually south of us in Santa Cruz. And so that was the particular scenario that happened, that people did get home. Well, something happens in the Bay Area proper. They're estimating 18 times the amount of road closures that were gone, that it happened during the original prior situation, and more and more people stuck at work. So one thing we like to do is we use what we call an 100%, but have it adjusted by an attrition rate model. And that is simply saying, I am going to cover 100% of the employees for the first 24 hours. And again, even if some of those employees are going to venture home, they have something they can take with them to protect them from that standpoint. And then you may make an assumption that, well, let's say half the people are going to be there day 2, and another half will leave, and you'll be left with the last quarter of your employee population day 3. And that is a scenario that gives you a lot more flexibility. Number one, you're protecting 100% of your employees, at least during the first critical 24 hours. And it's limiting the risk to all the employees. Your overall supplies are really aligned with your assumptions. And even if something did change and there was a different scope of what your assumptions were for day 2 and day 3, you're in a point in the event that is a lot easier to make decisions in with less of a time constraint on you. And so if there were more employees that had to stick around, you could at least adjust your distribution of those supplies. And if there are less, then you know that you're in good shape. If you want to get a little more scientific about it, you can even do a commute distance model. Look at the zip codes of where everybody lives and develop a little histogram. And we like to use kind of 10 miles as a rough rule of thumb, if you will, and making the assumption that everybody that lives within 10 miles will probably try to venture out. And so you can make that assumption for day 2 and day 3, maybe a little closer to a particular situation. One of our clients had a headquarters for many years in a particular town, and it was very typical where employees, 30% of the employees lived within 10 miles. They relocated their facility about 20 miles away to a new town and a new facility. Well, people didn't move, and their situation actually was very different, where only, I think it was 10% of their people lived within that 10-mile number that we like to use. So they had to make some different assumptions for day 2 and day 3. Exercising with your resources. This is actually kind of a very, very common situation, and somebody gets tasked with getting the supplies, and they go through and get everything put away, and it's really kind of a mystery to everybody else. Maybe it was the head of EH&S that got the supplies, or the facilities manager, and they were kind of tasked with a scenario they talked about early on with, well, we've got a plan, we've got an emergency response team, let's get some supplies. And a lot of times your emergency response team doesn't even know what you have, and kind of the running joke is, who's got the key? They've never seen the supplies, they've been oriented the supplies, and maybe not even oriented on how to use some of the things. Something as necessary as putting up a easy up canopy as an example. Some people have never done that, and it's good to be able to kind of go through that particular situation before an event and not learn on the job. And so the issues you run into is the people aren't trained to the plan using their supplies. There's a limited awareness of what's in the supply cache, and the supplies may not be aligned to the operational response that you've outlined in the objectives. So that gets back to aligning the threats with the plan, with the supplies, and training with the supplies. This is an example that I thought was very good. This is a particular client that actually took things to a very, they went through a lot of these concepts as far as really trying to get the right supplies, looking at what they were tasked to do in their emergency response plan, and making sure that everything was aligned. And The first thing they did is they listed out, in this particular example, this was one of their interim exercises where they got their team together and went through an orientation of the supplies, and they actually took it to the point where they reorganized their supplies based on how their team worked. And what they found out in listing out all the supplies functionally was that there's a certain section of the supplies that they called organizational, and those were the open for business supplies. And those were the things like the head count sheet, the building plan, some hard hats, some lighting, some tables, what the team needed just to get their incident command situation set up. And that was what they called their open for business. The other things tended to be more situational in nature. Search and rescue, first aid and triage, those kind of key components. That really depended on the event. If it was a simple medical emergency, maybe all they're doing is going in and getting some of their first aid and triage items. If it was something of a lot more magnitude, again, like earthquake or a building fire and explosion, those types of things, where you're going to start deploying a lot of things. You're going to get your first aid area and triage set up. You're going to get your search and rescue items going. Then there are things that were what they called situational and time-bound. If it's going to go into extensive time for a number of days, well, then you have to think about things like sanitation. You have to start planning out your day 2 and day 3 food and water. And so these items tend to be more related to the duration. And so by going through this and looking at things in that very analytical approach, the team now became very familiar with their supplies, and they were oriented to the assumptions. They actually exercised with the supplies and practiced with them. They took out the search and rescue items. They put up an easy up canopy. They set up a first aid and triage area. And what came out of that is they were able to identify what worked and what didn't work. And the interesting thing here was that in one of their exercises, they felt they had a robust set of supplies. And you looked at everything they had, you would say, yep, they're right on. They've got everything they need. But in practicing, they realized that they had an awful lot of petite people on their teams. And the hard hats and the gloves were literally falling off those folks that were petite. And they couldn't use a hard hat, and they couldn't perform their tasks with the standard size work gloves that they were provided. And that is something they would have never seen had they not practiced. And their corrective action, of course, was to special order some particular hard hats and get fitted work gloves. And again, that was something that you don't want to find out in the heat of an actual event. So encourage everybody to exercise with their supplies. If you haven't, that is the one takeaway that you need to get from this entire discussion today. You know, we talked about metrics and those types of things. But when you actually practice with the supplies, that type of information will come out, and you can effectively do continuous improvement. So we've gone through quite a few topics today. And we talked about the metrics that are needed in designing your supply cache. Look about usage rates. Really peel that onion back. Something as simple as looking at the flashlight, thinking about how that will be used and how long the batteries last. You really have to kind of take it to that level. Make sure everything is usable. It's not a matter of throwing everything in a shipping container and saying you're good to go. It really has to be thought of as a giant kit. That's the tools that your team has to work with. It has to go in. You need to be able to get what they need and take care of business. And you're going to have an awful lot of untrained volunteers you may need to press into action. Your members of your team may not be there that day. It may be a bigger scope than you ever thought. So think about things that make it usable. This simple example of color coding was a prime example. You can take somebody who has no idea of what your supplies are and where they are and actually be able to utilize them just by the simple act of color coding. Understand the allocation of the supplies, who was meant to get what, and make sure everybody is aware. That way the communication happens. Things change. There will never be an event that goes exactly like you thought it would. So at least if you know the assumptions going into it, you will be able to react appropriately and minimize the impact and minimize waste of time. The distribution and deployment, again, things in kit form. You're looking at coverage. Think about making sure everybody has some kind of protection. You're taking care of everybody, and then you can make some adjustments to an attrition rate that you think will happen either through looking at commute distances or things of that nature and make kind of an educated guess. I'm certainly not advocating your goal is to have supplies for 3 days that you're going to be able to support your entire group for 3 days. That may not be economically feasible, but certainly based on attrition rate model, you can get closer to that point. And then again, as I said, be sure to exercise with the supplies. That's where you're going to find out what works and what different. No matter how good of a list you've had, and no matter how good of you've thought about the metrics, the exercise will really prove things out for you. So what we like to do at Firestorm is look at in kind of a predict, plan, and perform type of orientation. So your next step is to really look at your threats and look at your emergency response plan and the objectives you have for that, and making sure that your supplies are part of that thinking. It's not something where you've just done the task of get some supplies. Think about how it fits in the overall plan. And so you can design your supply resource matrix and figure out the types of deployment scenarios that you may be faced with. And orienting everyone on your team, even if you're in your company to a certain degree, about what to expect in terms of your resources so that they know what's at their disposal and they can do the particular tasks that they're doing. And then always revise and update your plan based on your post-event hot wash. That's where you learn what worked and what didn't, and if you have the right kind of supplies. And maybe you too will find out that you've got varying needs of gloves and hard hats on your team, and that's when you're going to find that out, and you can make the appropriate improvements from that standpoint. We're getting to the end of our time here, and the brief will be available in a few days for the information of this particular webinar. And it will be at firestore.com/briefs. And I want to thank the Greater Rochester Chamber of Commerce and ACP for co-hosting this event today, and we look forward to future webinars with Firestorm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And if you want to contact Jeff, notice that it's jhamilton@firestorm.com. Thank you very much. I hope you can join us next month. Goodbye.